They fired me from the family business in front of everyone. I left without a word because sometimes silence is the sharpest blade. My name is Linda Carter, and the last words my husband spat at me in that boardroom still echo in my ears. Get out, you useless woman. Your place is the kitchen, not the office. He said it in front of everyone, our employees, our son, even his brother-in-law, who barely lifted a finger for the business. I remember the way his voice bounced off those polished wood panels, the way people's eyes darted away from mine. Ashamed for me, maybe relieved it wasn't them. I didn't argue, I didn't beg, I didn't cry. I only smiled quietly, picked up my purse, and walked out. At that moment, they thought I had been defeated. What none of them knew was that walking away was the first step toward taking everything back. It might seem strange to start here in the middle of the storm, but I want you to feel the sting before I tell you how it all began. Because betrayal doesn't come out of nowhere. It builds piece by piece while you're too busy keeping things together to notice. Let me take you back to where it all started, too. The life we built, the sacrifices I made, and the blindness that let him believe he could throw me away like yesterday's trash. I was born and raised in Wilmington, North Carolina. My folks were the type that believed in hard work, God, and community. Daddy worked at the shipyard and Mama was a school secretary. They didn't have much, but they gave me two things I've carried all my life, grit and pride. Grit meant you kept going even when the path was rocky. Pride meant you held your head high no matter how folks tried to tear you down. Those two lessons carried me through everything that came later. When I married David, I was 22 and full of hope. He was ambitious, charming, the kind of man who could sell ice to an Eskimo, as Daddy used to say. We started small, renting a garage where he repaired boat engines while I handled the books. Nights I'd sit at our kitchen table with a calculator and ledger while our baby daughter slept in the next room. By day, I answered phones, ran errands, and soothed angry customers. We didn't have money for staff, so I was the staff. He called me his right hand, and I wore that like a badge of honor. Over the years, the business grew. We expanded into selling parts, then full boats. David's charm worked wonders with clients, and my discipline kept the numbers straight. He was the face. I was the foundation. Folks in town admired him for his smooth talk. But I noticed the way some wives nodded toward me at church, knowing who really kept the ship afloat. Still, I never asked for recognition. My joy was in seeing our hard work put food on the table and watching our kids grow up, without wanting for much. But with success came arrogance. David started spending more time at the marina drinking late, with clients boasting about his genius. At family gatherings, he'd joke that I was just the bookkeeper, as if all those sleepless nights balancing invoices hadn't kept us out of bankruptcy. At first, I laughed it off. Everyone knows husbands puff up their egos, right? But the jokes turned sharper, the dismissals colder. He began to believe his own myth that he alone had built our little empire. I remember one Thanksgiving when his mother praised the business, saying how proud she was of David. I was standing right there carving the turkey, and he winked at me, saying, "She just makes sure I don't overspend on bait." Laughter rippled around the table. My cheeks burned, but I smiled like a dutiful wife. I told myself it didn't matter, that the truth would hold on its own. But the truth I would learn isn't enough when someone decides to rewrite history. By the time our kids left for college, the company was worth more than I ever dreamed we'd have. New trucks, a bigger office, a small warehouse by the docks. We had a reputation across the state. And I was fading into the background, even in my own story. David hired his brother-in-law, a man who couldn't tell a carburetor from a coffee pot, but he carried the last name, and that was enough. Soon I was being pushed aside in meetings, my opinions brushed off like lint. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. Nothing special about it except that David walked into the boardroom with a face like thunder. He didn't even sit down before pointing at me. "Get out, you useless woman. Your place is the kitchen, not the office." Just like that, in front of the people who'd known me for 20 years. My heart thudded, but not from shame, from clarity. In that single sentence, I saw the truth of the man I'd married. I had given my youth, my sweat, my love, and in return, I was nothing more than a punchline. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. Defending myself would have meant giving him the dignity of my words. No. I stood, smoothed my skirt, picked up my purse, and smiled. It wasn't the smile of a beaten woman. It was the smile of someone who finally saw the game for what it was and was ready to play it better. When I stepped into the hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. For the first time in years, I felt a strange kind of freedom. I had no plan yet, no revenge cooking in my mind, just a certainty that walking away wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Looking back now, I realize how important that moment was. Not just for the story I'm about to tell, but for anyone who's ever been underestimated. Sometimes you have to be shoved out the door to realize you were the one holding the keys all along. I walked out of that office with nothing but my purse and my pride. The autumn air in Wilmington had that crisp bite to it, the kind that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, staring at the trucks lined up with our company logo plastered on the side, Carter Marine Services. My last name was on that sign too, but I felt invisible. Employees walked past me, some offering sympathetic glances, others pretending not to notice. Nobody spoke. That silence was louder than any insult David had hurled at me. I drove home in our old Ford, the one we'd bought back when we could barely afford gas. Every mile felt heavier. Memories came flooding in, late nights doing payroll at the kitchen table, hauling invoices to the bank, teaching myself how to use QuickBooks when nobody else cared to learn. All those pieces of myself I'd poured into the business were still there, buried under his arrogance. And now he thought he could erase me with one cruel sentence. When I walked through my front door, the house was too quiet. The kids were grown, gone off to their own lives. My daughter lived in Raleigh with her husband. My son was stationed with the Navy down in Jacksonville. They had called that morning, both checking in on me after weeks of tension, sensing something was wrong. I hadn't told them the truth. I didn't want them to think less of their father, not yet. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the same spot where I'd once scribbled numbers on napkins, and I let myself cry. Not loud, not desperate, just steady tears that slid down without asking permission. It would have been easy to collapse into bitterness. Lord knows, many women in my shoes would have packed a bag, gone to stay with their sister, maybe filed for divorce on the spot. But something inside me stiffened. Maybe it was Mama's voice reminding me, grit and pride, Linda, don't you ever forget. Maybe it was the way David's words had sliced so deep I couldn't let them be the final word. Whatever it was, I decided I would not be defined by his dismissal. The next morning I went to church. Not because I had answers, but because I needed a place where my heart could settle. Reverend Thomas greeted me at the door, that kind smile of his, as steady as it had been since I was a girl. He didn't ask questions, just shook my hand and said, "The Lord sees what's done in the dark." That was all. But it was enough to remind me I wasn't invisible. Sitting there in the pew, the stained glass casting colors over my lap, I whispered to myself, "He thinks he won. Let's see how long that lasts." In the days that followed, I kept to myself. I cooked for one, walked. The neighborhood waved at neighbors who asked politely how things were going. Nobody knew the storm brewing behind my smile. At night, I pulled out old ledgers and receipts I had tucked away in boxes. Proof of every transaction I'd handled, every contract I'd signed, every late-night budget that had saved the company. The paper trail was long, and it had my fingerprints all over it. One evening, as I sorted through a stack of old files, I found a folder marked with my father-in-law's handwriting. He'd passed years ago, but he had been the one to give us our first loan, the one to believe in me, when David was too busy bragging to notice the details. Inside the folder was a copy of his will. My heart stopped. I'd seen it before, but never closely. I read line after line, and there it was clear as day. His shares of the company, his controlling interest, were to pass to the surviving spouse who has demonstrated consistent service and loyalty to the business. Not to David by name, not to his children, to the spouse who carried the weight. I sat back stunned. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the realization that my father-in-law had seen the truth all along. He knew who had kept the business alive. He knew David's charm was just polish, not foundation. And he had written it down, sealed it with ink. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. For the first time I had something David couldn't erase, with a raised voice or a pointing finger. But I wasn't ready to use it yet. No, timing was everything. Mama always said, "The best revenge is letting a fool dig his own hole." And David was already digging. Rumors trickled through town that he'd taken on risky contracts, overpromised to suppliers, and brought his brother-in-law into deals he didn't understand. Customers complained about late orders. Employees whispered about paychecks being delayed. The mighty Carter Marine Services was starting to crack. I walked past the marina one afternoon and saw David pacing the docks, phone pressed to his ear, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool breeze. He looked smaller somehow, like a man carrying too many debts on his shoulders. He didn't notice me, but I saw him, and I smiled not with spite but with certainty. Because I knew something he didn't. I wasn't gone. I wasn't useless. I was waiting, and when the time came, the truth would speak louder than any insult. The cracks in David's empire widened faster than I expected. Within a couple of weeks, word spread that shipments were delayed, suppliers weren't being paid, and one of the trucks had been repossessed because the note was past due. The same folks who used to shake his hand at Rotary Club started avoiding him in the grocery store. I watched from a distance, never saying a word. I'd spent too many years cleaning up his messes. This time, he could sit in the rubble alone. Every morning, I kept to a routine coffee in my favorite chipped mug, a walk through our neighborhood, then an hour at the kitchen table combing through documents. I wasn't plotting revenge the way some might imagine. No, I was gathering clarity, reminding myself of the truth that had been buried under his arrogance. Bank statements, canceled checks, contracts, my name was on so many of them. If anyone ever questioned who had held the company together, the paper trail would answer. But as much as I was preparing, I wasn't immune to pain. Nights were the hardest. Lying alone in that big house, I felt the emptiness pressing in. 40 years of marriage, 2 grown children, decades of shared struggle, and now silence. Sometimes I wondered if it would have been easier to walk away with nothing, start over in some small apartment with just my dignity. But then I'd remember his face in that boardroom, the smug twist of his mouth as he called me useless. That memory lit a fire I couldn't extinguish. One afternoon, my daughter Emily called. Her voice carried that blend of concern and stubbornness she inherited from me. "Mom, what's going on?" Dad sounded off when I talked to him. "And you've been so quiet." I almost told her everything, but I swallowed the truth and said, "We're working through some things. Don't worry about me, honey." She paused, then said softly, "Just don't let him take away your joy, Mom. You've always been stronger than he knew." Her words stuck with me long after we hung up. Around that time, I met with a lawyer, an old friend from church, James Whitaker. We sat in his office, the walls lined with framed degrees and photos of his grandkids. I slid the folder with my father-in-law's will across the desk. He read it slowly, then looked up at me with raised eyebrows. "Linda," he said, "this is powerful. If David drives the business into the ground, this document could change everything. But timing is crucial. If we move too soon, he'll fight tooth and nail. If we wait, his own mistakes will make our case ironclad." I nodded. "So we wait." James leaned back, studying me. "You're calmer than most folks in your shoes." I smiled faintly. I've had a lifetime of practice. The waiting wasn't easy. There were days I longed to march back into that office and slam the will down on the conference table. But patience became my weapon. I kept my head down, went to church-baked pies for the ladies' luncheon, visited my mother's grave, and let David's recklessness tighten the noose he'd fashioned himself. Meanwhile, the town noticed. People I'd known for decades would pull me aside at the market or after Sunday service. "Linda, we don't understand what's happening down at Carter Marine. Things just aren't the same without you." Their words were bittersweet, comforting, but also a reminder of how invisible I had allowed myself to become. One evening, I drove past the office. The lights were still on, and through the window I saw David slumped at his desk tie, loosened papers scattered everywhere. His brother-in-law stood nearby, shrugging helplessly. For a brief moment, my heart softened. This was the man I'd once loved enough to build a life with. But then I remembered the humiliation, the cruelty, the way he dismissed me, not just privately, but in front of everyone. Sympathy shriveled back into steel. It was about that time the phone calls started. Creditors, suppliers, even a banker I'd known for years reached out not to David but to me. They trusted me more than him. "Linda, what's really going on? Can we expect payment?" I told them the truth. I wasn't part of the company anymore. But their questions confirmed what I already knew. David's credibility was sinking faster than a stone in water. Still, I didn't gloat. That wasn't my style. I prayed at night asking for wisdom. Revenge can be a dangerous thing if it eats you alive. What I wanted wasn't to destroy him. It was to reclaim the respect and dignity he'd stolen. One Sunday after service, Reverend Thomas pulled me aside. He looked me in the eye and said, "Sometimes the Lord doesn't call us to fight. Sometimes he just calls us to stand still and watch." His words gave me peace. So I stood still, and I watched. By the end of that month, Carter Marine Services was hanging by a thread. Checks bounced, vendors refused to ship, and rumors spread that bankruptcy was near. David's swagger was gone. In its place was desperation. The man who had once strutted through town now avoided eye contact. His shoulders slumped, his hair graying faster than time alone could explain. And me, I kept smiling, because I knew the moment was coming, the moment when everything he thought he owned would slip through his fingers and the truth would finally be revealed. The collapse came slowly at first, then all at once. That's how ruin usually happens, like a dam cracking drip by drip until the whole wall gives way. By the second month after he threw me out, David had lost 3 of our biggest clients. One was a fishing company out of Charleston, another a small Navy contract we'd been proud to land years before. They walked away citing unreliable service. The truth. Without me balancing the books and smoothing over relationships, the trust we'd built dissolved. I heard about these things not from David, but from the folks who'd known me for decades. Mrs. Dawson from the hardware store leaned in close while ringing up my order. "Linda, honey, I don't know what's going on with David, but everyone's saying the company's in trouble. Shame after all you did to build it." Her voice carried sympathy, but also that small-town sting news traveled faster than fire in dry grass. I smiled politely, but inside my heart tightened. I never wanted to see the business fall apart. It was my life's work too, but David had forced me out, and if he couldn't see the value I brought, then this was the price. At night, I'd sit at my kitchen table with a lamp casting warm light on the piles of files. My hands would linger over old invoices I'd saved, contracts with my initials at the bottom, copies of tax filings I'd completed myself. I'd whisper, "They think you did nothing." But the paper remembers. Sometimes the loneliness pressed harder than the anger. I missed the hum of the office, the smell of motor oil mixed with fresh coffee, the clatter of tools from the shop. I missed the rhythm of being part of something bigger than myself. Yet in that silence, I also rediscovered who I was, apart from David. Not just a bookkeeper, not just the wife. I was the backbone that kept things upright, and that realization steadied me. One Thursday afternoon, my lawyer James called. "Linda, you might want to come down to the courthouse tomorrow. There's going to be a creditor's hearing. Word is Carter Marine is being forced into bankruptcy." The word sent a chill through me. Bankruptcy. I closed my eyes, remembering all the years of scraping by, the sacrifices, the sweat poured into that company. But I didn't argue. I just said I'll be there. The next morning, I walked into that courthouse wearing a navy blue dress and my mother's pearl necklace. Simple, dignified, but firm. The hall smelled faintly of polish and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to institutions where lives get reshaped. When I entered the hearing room, David was already there, shoulders hunched, his brother-in-law fidgeting beside him. He didn't look at me, but I saw the lines etched deeper in his face, the weight of pride, crumbling. The judge asked questions, creditors listed debts, and David's voice cracked as he tried to explain missed payments and failed contracts. My chest tightened, not from pity, but from the gravity of watching a man undone by his own arrogance. When the proceedings ended, James leaned toward me and whispered, "Not yet. Let the dust settle. The will comes later." I nodded, holding my tongue. In the weeks that followed, Carter Marine's signs came down. Trucks were sold off, the warehouse emptied, the once busy office turned into a hollow shell. People in town shook their heads, saying it was tragic, asking what had gone wrong. Some already suspected the truth. Without me, the business had no anchor. David tried calling me a few times. I let the phone ring. He left voicemails, angry at first, then pleading. "Linda, we need to talk. You can't just abandon everything. I can fix this if you help me." His voice cracked on the last word. I sat in my living room, staring at the phone, my hand still. For years I had answered his every call, solved his every crisis. Not this time. Meanwhile, I kept gathering. James and I met twice a week. We spread documents across his mahogany desk, building a case brick by brick. When the time is right, James said, tapping his finger on my father-in-law's will, "This is going to change everything." At night I prayed. Not for David's ruin that had already come, but for my own heart not to grow bitter. Revenge can hollow a person out if you let it. What I wanted wasn't destruction. What I wanted was recognition, dignity restored. Then came the day the lawyer representing the estate scheduled a formal reading of my father-in-law's will. I walked into that wood-paneled office, my pulse steady. Family members gathered, David, his brother-in-law, even our daughter Emily, who had flown in after hearing whispers. She looked at me with wide eyes, sensing something big was about to unfold. The lawyer, an older gentleman with silver hair and half-moon glasses, cleared his throat. According to Mr. Carter's will, his controlling shares and assets of Carter Marine Services shall pass to the surviving spouse who has demonstrated consistent service and loyalty to the business. He paused, his gaze flicking toward me. That individual is Linda Carter. The room went silent. I felt the weight of years, decades pressing down, then lifting. Emily reached for my hand, squeezing it tight. David's mouth opened, then closed. His brother-in-law muttered something under his breath, face red as a tomato. I blinked back, tears. Not because of the money or the shares, but because finally, after all this time, the truth had been spoken aloud. The man who had seen me most clearly, my father-in-law, had written it into law. David's face drained of color. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before, fear. I didn't speak right away. After the will was read, I sat still with Emily's hand wrapped around mine, letting the words settle like dust after a long storm. That individual's Linda Carter. You would think I'd shout or stand up with a triumphant speech. Instead, I felt a slow, steady warmth rise in my chest like a furnace finally catching after a cold winter. When I looked at David, I didn't see a villain. I saw a man who had believed his own legend for so long that reality felt like betrayal. The lawyer slid a packet across the table, certified copy of the will filings already queued to transfer the shares. There were steps of course recognition by the probate court, updated corporate paperwork with the Secretary of State notices to the bank. Nothing happens with a wave of the hand in real life, but the road was clear. James, my lawyer, nodded to me as if to say, "You've got this." Outside the building, the autumn sun felt warmer than it should have. Emily hugged me so tight I could feel her heartbeat. "Mom," she whispered. I knew there was more to the story. I kissed her temple and told her I was all right. That was partly true. The truth is, never neat joy came, braided with grief for years, lost dignity, pawned off cheap, and bought back slowly. That evening, my phone lit up with numbers I hadn't seen in months. Vendors, old clients, even a banker at Cape Fear Community who'd watched our accounts since the early days. I answered each call with the same measured tone. Yes, I have controlling interest. Yes, we're stabilizing. No, I'm not making promises tonight. But I will meet with you in the morning. It felt like returning to a house you built and finding it dusty but still standing, familiar, fixable. The next morning, I put on a gray blazer and low heels, tied a scarf at my neck the way Mama used to, and headed to the office we'd once been proud to open. The sign out front had been taken down after the bankruptcy filing, but the outline of the letters still ghosted the brick Carter Marine Services. Inside the place smelled like paper and stale coffee, desks, half-cleared chairs, askew a stack of unopened mail leaning like a tired man. In the back, I found a box with my name still scrawled on it. Inside lay a mug from our first boat show, a tape dispenser that always stuck, and a Polaroid of David and me when the paint was still wet on our first sign. I traced the edge of the picture with my thumb. We weren't all bad, I murmured to no one. Two longtime employees, Jean from the shop and Sandra from the front desk, stepped through the door, hesitant as school kids. Jean had grease in the creases of his fingers the way some men carry memories. Sandra clutched her purse like a shield. "Mrs. Carter," she asked, soft. "Is it true?" "It is," I said. "If you want to sit a spell, I'd like to talk about a plan." We sat at the old conference table, no board, no bluster. Just three people with coffee in paper cups and hope measured out in careful teaspoons. I told them I didn't know whether we would keep the old name or start anew. I said there would be no miracles. We would contact vendors, square up what we honestly could, and ask for a little grace on the rest. We would not lie. We would not overpromise. We would not pretend that nothing had happened. Jean fiddled with his cap. We followed orders, he said, shame rumbling in his voice. "But we always knew you kept us straight, Miss Linda." I put my hand over his. "Nobody's here for punishment. We're here to set things right." By noon, I was at the bank with James. The manager, Mrs. Patel, greeted me with the kind of professional warmth that tells you she's seen everything and still believes in people. We opened new accounts, clean and proper, and arranged to meet the main supplier by week's end. I left with a small line of credit, not enough to fly, enough to stand. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding since the day I walked out of that boardroom. Later that week, I drove to the marina. The docks whispered beneath my feet the way they always had, old wood speaking in Sultan time. A fisherman named Joe waved me over, the same man who'd bought his first used skiff from us 20 years ago. "Heard you're back in charge," he said, smile, tugging the corner of his mouth. "Good. Maybe we'll get parts on time again. We both laughed, the kind that holds a little sadness and a lot of relief. I wish I could say that everything clicked back into place overnight. It didn't. There were difficult calls and harder meetings. One supplier told me flatly he wouldn't ship until old invoices were paid. I apologized, owned the debt we could prove, and offered a payment plan with a schedule I taped to my office wall like a promise. He didn't smile, but he nodded. That was enough. I avoided David's calls as long as I could. But eventually, dignity demanded a meeting. We sat across from each other at the same conference table where he'd humiliated me. He looked thinner, hollowed out like pride had been keeping him fed, and someone had taken the plate away. He started with a sigh. I don't expect you to forgive me, Linda. I'm not here to referee your expectations, I said. I'm here to talk about what comes next. I made mistakes, he admitted, the words falling like rusted bolts. I thought I could do it without you. I was wrong. I waited, letting silence be the judge. He rubbed his temples. What do you want me to do? Resign from any formal role, I said. No shadow decisions. No backdoors. If you want to work the yard sweeping, helping with deliveries, there's dignity in honest labor. But you won't stand in this room and call shots you're not equipped to call. He swallowed. And us? I looked at the Polaroid I'd set between us, a young couple and a new sign. We will always have a history, I said. But history is not a leash. He nodded, eyes damp, but proud enough to blink the tears away. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anger when I looked at him. I felt the cool, steady certainty of a boundary set and held. That weekend, I brought coffee and cinnamon rolls to the shop. We swept, we set up an old radio, we laughed at Jean's corny jokes, and we wrote a list on the whiteboard labeled Monday Calls. I printed new work orders with simple letterhead Carter Marine under new management. Maybe we'd change the name later. For now, I needed our people to know the heart had changed, not just the paperwork. On Sunday, I slipped into my usual pew. Reverend Thomas preached about the Israelites picking up manna, just enough for the day, no hoarding tomorrow's blessings. I thought about invoices and bank statements and the quiet, stubborn tasks of rebuilding a life. After service, a woman I barely knew squeezed my hand and whispered, "I'm proud of you." I nodded because I finally felt proud of me too. That evening, as I closed the office, I turned off each light slowly, room by room, the way you tuck in a child at night. In the last glow from the hallway, I saw my reflection in the conference room glass, older, yes, but standing straighter than I had in years. I remembered the moment he'd said, "Get out, you useless woman," and realized the sweetest part of all this wasn't being named in the will or even gaining the shares. It was hearing my own voice again, steady and sure. And for the first time since the day I walked out with nothing but my purse, I allowed myself to imagine not just survival, but a future shaped by my own hands. The weeks after I reclaimed control of the business felt like breathing new air, sharp, clean, and bracing. There was no illusion about the road ahead. Carter Marine was battered, our reputation bruised, but we weren't dead. I threw myself into rebuilding one small step at a time. I started each morning the same way, a strong cup of coffee, a quiet prayer at the kitchen window, and a list of 3 things I could realistically accomplish that day. It kept me steady, kept me from drowning in the sheer size of the task. Vendors who once slammed the door slowly opened it again. Some required cash up front, and I swallowed my pride to agree. Others said they'd give me one last chance because they trusted me, not David. That distinction was not lost on me. For years I had been invisible, a shadow behind the charming face of the business. Now they spoke to me directly, shaking my hand, asking about my plans. It was bittersweet proof that my worth had been seen all along, just ignored by the man closest to me. I held staff meetings every Monday, not with pomp or bluster, but with coffee and open notebooks. We sat around the conference table. No head of the table nonsense. I told them what bills we could pay, what jobs were coming in, and where we were still vulnerable. They listened, they asked questions, and slowly they began to believe again. Sandra, the receptionist who'd always been sharp as a tack, suggested new software to track orders. Gene offered to bring in his nephew as an apprentice mechanic. Little by little, faith returned. Meanwhile, David kept circling on the edges of my life. Some days he'd call, other days he'd show up uninvited at the office. At first I wanted to send him away every time, but I let him stand there, humbled no longer, the swaggering man who barked orders. He asked once if I'd let him back into the leadership role. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "You had your turn. The damage is yours. The rebuilding is mine." His mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. I think he knew he'd lost more than a company. He'd lost the right to call me less than I was. One afternoon, Emily visited again. She walked through the office, taking in the humming phones, the scent of grease and salt air, the staff busy at their desks. She turned to me and said, "Mom, this feels alive again." Like you feel alive again. Her words warmed me more than any balance sheet ever could. But the real test came when the court summoned us for the final estate settlement. The room was packed, family members, former partners, even a couple of employees who wanted to see the outcome. The judge asked routine questions, the lawyer confirmed the paperwork, and finally the order was stamped and filed. Legally, publicly, undeniably, I was the rightful owner of Carter Marine Services. David sat across the room, his face pale. When the gavel fell, he lowered his head. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then he stood, walked over, and before the judge, before our children, before everyone, he sank to his knees. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice rough. "Linda, I was a fool. I thought I was bigger than all of this. I thought I was bigger than you. But I see now I was nothing without you." The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. My heart pounded. Part of me wanted to reach down, lift him up, say the words that would ease his shame. But another part, the deeper part, remembered the sting of his voice that day in the boardroom. "Get out, you useless woman." I bent slightly, my voice calm but firm. "You didn't just lose a company, David. You lost my respect. And that, you can't buy back." He looked up, eyes wet, searching for mercy. I straightened, turned to the judge, and said, "I think we're finished here." Emily slipped her arm through mine as we walked out. Behind us, David stayed on his knees. In the hallway, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from release. After years of silence, humiliation, and being pushed aside, I had reclaimed not only my business, but my voice, my worth, my life. The sun outside was bright that afternoon, glinting off the courthouse steps. I paused, looked up, and let it warm my face. For the first time in decades, I felt truly free. The courthouse scene stayed with me for days. Folks around town couldn't stop talking about it, how David, once the loudest man in every room, had fallen silent on his knees. Some called it poetic justice, others said it was tragic. But when neighbors stopped me in the market or at church, all I told them was, "It's done." Because it was. The storm had broken. Now the work of living in the sunlight remained. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself into rebuilding Carter Marine, not just as a business, but as a place where dignity mattered. We didn't chase after every contract anymore. We chose the ones we could handle with honesty. We didn't promise the moon, we promised steady service. Some customers left, but the ones who stayed were loyal. The phone rang less, but when it did, the voice on the other end trusted us. That was worth more than any flashy growth. At home, I settled into a new rhythm. My mornings began not with dread, but with purpose. I'd walk down to the dock with my coffee, watch the sunrise over the water, and let the gulls remind me that life keeps moving. My evenings were quiet, filled with books I'd never had time to read, and calls with Emily and our son. They told me they were proud of me, not because I'd won in court, but because I'd held on to myself. That meant more than any inheritance. David tried in small ways to stay connected. He showed up at the marina sometimes, sweeping floors or loading crates, never asking for authority. Once he brought me a bag of donuts from the old bakery downtown, setting them on the counter without a word. I nodded thanks, but didn't invite conversation. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't the same as forgetting. Some wounds close, but the scars stay to remind you of the lesson. One Sunday after service, Reverend Thomas stopped me at the door. "Linda," he said, "sometimes God doesn't give us victory so we can boast. Sometimes he gives it so we can bless others." His words sank deep. I knew my story wasn't just mine. It was a lantern for anyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or cast aside. So here's what I want to say to you. Listening now, if you've ever been called useless, if you've ever been told your place is smaller than you know in your bones it is, don't let that be the final word. The truth has a way of rising like the tide. You don't need to scream or beg to be seen. Sometimes you just need to stand steady and silent and wait for the day when the world catches up to what you already know. When David knelt before me begging for forgiveness, I realized something important. The victory wasn't in his shame. It wasn't in the company shares or the legal documents. The victory was in the simple fact that I no longer doubted myself. I had walked through humiliation, through loneliness, through nights of doubt, and I had come out standing tall. And so to anyone listening, hold fast. Your worth is not measured by the loudest voice in the room or the cruelest insult thrown your way. Your worth is written in the quiet work you do, the steady love you give, the truth you carry. Don't surrender it, no matter who tries to strip it away. If this story speaks to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like mine of justice, of resilience, of dignity, reclaim, subscribe, and stay with us. Because you're not alone. None of us are. This is my story. This is my truth. And this finally is my peace. Respect is the true inheritance. Without it, wealth means nothing.